The Opinion with Michael J. The conservatives talk about the lost decade, the lost liberal decade. It used to be the lost liberal decade under Trudeau, but now it's just the lost liberal decade. And this is the mantra of Pierre Poilievre, Daniel Smith, and the separatist movement within Alberta, further compounded by the voices of Andrew Scheer, every other conservative, every one of their followers, including the followers of the UCP. And I'm here to tell you that this is not true. This is a false narrative, and you're just buying into a false narrative. And you say, what? How is that friggin' possible? I'll tell you how it's possible. We're going to focus on America because America influences Canada. No matter how you slice it, Canada is no bigger than the state of Texas. So if you're going to compare GDP, compare the GDP of Texas with all of Canada. Full stop. Everything else is just friggin' bunk. So this lost liberal decade is just friggin' bullshit. Did I say that? Yes, I did. Bullshit with a capital B and a capital S. So, WTF. We're going to watch this video. WTF, how history works. What the F happened in 1971. So, you got to go back to 1970 in order to understand what happened. Now, a lot of these people that follow the conservatives, believe in the conservative movement, can't think back to 1970, may not have been alive back in 1970, know no real history of what happened in 1970, but let's take a look and see exactly what is going on here. So, take it away.
Looking at economic data can sometimes be a bit bleak. Over the last 5 decades, wages have been left behind by economic productivity. Houses have gone from an essential good to a coveted investment. We are saving less money than ever before. Prices for everyday goods have outpaced earnings. The financial industry has become the largest sector in the economy. Debt around the world has spiked to unsustainable levels, and inequality has broken new records. For the first time since the Gilded Age, the top 0.1% in America controls more wealth than the bottom 90%.
Holy moly, say it ain't so, Joe. That's a shoeless Joe thing. If you're into baseball. So, let's recapitulate. Recapitulate? Yeah, we're just going to regurgitate, recapitulate, give you a bit of an idea of where I'm coming from. So, over the last 5 decades, this is what we've seen so far, wages have been left behind by economic productivity. Houses have gone from an essential good to a coveted investment. And what you have to understand, back in 1970, a house was considered a money pit, a forced way to make savings out of the equity in your house for your retirement. That's the way it was. Nobody profited like they did in the 80s and beyond on houses back in the 1970s. Didn't happen. House was considered a money pit, and it was a forced savings plan to be able to save up for your retirement, just based on whatever equity you've paid down on your house to be able to use when you retire. This is really what happened. Now, prices for everyday goods, and this is where the inflation boondoggle, and you got to understand, why is inflation being able to not being deregulated? Because now the cost of everyday goods have far outstripped any wage increase. And it's been purposely, wage increases have been purposely kept low, especially in the United States, and ever since the Reagan-Thatcher era. And so what's become the biggest sector in the economy? The financial sector. Really just legalized gambling for the most part, talking Wall Street, NASDAQ, etc., S&P. So, debt around the world has increased. Now, here's the other thing. For the first time ever since the Gilded Age, and this is where Donald Trump's trying to take the United States back, and this is why he's using tariffs during the McKinley era of 1890, and later incorporated by Herbert Hoover in 1929. So, for the first time ever now, the top 0.1%, we're not talking the top 1%, we're talking top 0.1% in America controls more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. So you got a pyramid. Few people, select few, 0.1% sit at the top. And the people that are at the bottom is the 90%ers. Can you believe it? Now here's the thing. We need to change that, where the people at the bottom are lifting up the people at the top. Just saying, folks. Let's get back to the video.
Percent combined. Elon Musk alone recently became the richest person in history, topping even the generous inflation-adjusted estimates of John D. Rockefeller in his prime. Although, to be fair, John D's prime lasted a lot longer than Musk's did. Anyway, all of this data tells a concerning story of a world that is heading in a bad direction. A direction that we have seen end in catastrophe many times throughout history before. But if you have keen eyes, or you just read the title of this video, you might have noticed that all of these alarming indicators took a bad turn at around the same time. So what the fuck happened in 1971?
I directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
With which we are watching this.
A lot of people, their first natural reaction based on this is saying we've got to go back to the gold standard backing the money system. No, that is not the way we need to go. But it points out the change that manifested as a result of Nixon removing gold as a backstop for the currency, the U.S. dollar. And don't forget, because of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the U.S. dollar was the reserve currency of the world, which gave the United States a lot of perquisites. What's a perquisite? Well, it's kind of like you work for a company and they give you a car, a lease car, and you don't get charged for it. It's part of your package. That's a perquisite, okay? So Elon Musk has become the richest person in history, even more so than John D. Rockefeller after adjusted for inflation. And so, who are the most prominent people in the inauguration of Donald J. Trump? Oligarchs, just like the Russian oligarchs of Putin, which were put in place by a guy by the name of Boris Yeltsin, which were put in place by a guy that I know, that was my father-in-law, that engineered it for the USSR. Guy was laundering $76 billion a month. You guys don't know that because I've never told you that before, but now you know. Full disclosure. Let's go back to the video.
Market deteriorates out at the same time has fallen about 18%.
Soaring gas prices, falling home prices, and rising unemployment.
You have to kind of keep yourself out of harm's way, kind of pick spots, and if that spot's not working, you have to move on and wait for another spot.
The stock market is now down 21%.
On August 15th, 1971, then President Richard Nixon temporarily suspended the convertibility of American currency into gold, effectively putting the final nail in the coffin of the gold standard. Nixon never actually got around to reversing that temporary suspension. I guess something must have happened to him.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
So yeah, this announcement in particular gets a lot of attention as the turning point in modern economic history. The dividing line between the golden age of capitalism. Before this, everybody got a house in the suburbs, a Ford Cortina, and a stay-at-home wife. And afterwards...
And this is the dream that Pierre Poilievre was trying to sell you. The 1971 dream. The husband going to work with a briefcase. Maybe it was a satchel of tools, because even a guy that was a tradesman could do it as well. The wife staying at home doing some baking. Baking? Not bacon, but baking. Whatever she's cooking there. Could be roasting, could be baking. And the Ford Cortina, well, that's a UK thing. But the house was within reach of everybody back in 1971. And then we had the OPEC thing, and then we had interest that almost went up to 20%. There's a lot of things that people nowadays have been insulated from, do not know about, but I don't want to digress too far.
Everything got worse year after year until today, where you will own nothing and be happy. It's a compelling message that aligns neatly with the idea that money is no longer real since there is nothing physical backing it up. But there is a little bit more to it than that. For a majority of you watching from America, you should know that you actually have more of a right to own gold as a store of value today than you did back before 1971. More importantly, a lot of stuff changed in the 1970s, and focusing exclusively on the gold standard means that we would miss a lot of stuff that a few people would probably prefer to have kept swept under the rug. Finally, there is the simple burning question that must be answered. If dropping the gold standard messed up so many things, why did we do it? And why can't we just go back? Well, the reason why America got rid of gold convertibility in the first place is an initiative I can get behind wholeheartedly, sticking it to the French. After the Second World War, a bunch of major countries got together with the goal of making global trade and cooperation easier. The idea was that if countries were dependent on one another for finance and commerce, they would be less likely to go to war again. This conference, held in the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, was like the Woodstock for economists.
But here's the deal. This is what you need to know. What you need to know. The United States engineered the system for trade. It was engineered by the United States, and now you got Trump changing the rules of the game, moving the goalposts, pay as you play. He wants to friggin' take over the world. He wants to be the big shot. He coveted North Korea's Kim Il-jung, coveted Putin, coveted Orban in Hungary, even coveted a guy in Brazil for a short period of time. And here's another thing. You got the president of Serbia, who's been a Putin puppet. This is where, the Trump-Putin coalition goes a lot deeper than you guys realize. The guy from Serbia, who's been in power for over 10 years, was trying to sell a property development to a guy by the name of Don Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner of a Belgrade defense building that was a heritage site, but the heritage site designation got removed because somebody got a payoff, so that Don Jr. and Jared Kushner could develop so that they could profit by a building in Serbia. The guy from Serbia went to the United States and had to rush back because, the thing is going on in Serbia, they've had a lot of protests. Even Orban, Hungary, they're getting protests. This is what you need to know. There's things that are bubbling to the surface because, number one, if you take what didn't work in the past and keep trying to apply it to the present, why would you think it's going to work? Makes no sense. Dumbest thing you could do. That's why Stephen Harper and Pierre Poilievre stated in his Jordan B. Peterson interview, I'm just going to take what worked during our term during 2008 and just apply it to the present. And that's the same as what my thesis was when I went to university. Nothing's changed. Well, if you're just going to apply what hasn't changed, that's why the conservative policies will not work. People say, well, liberals stole the conservative policies. No, because the liberal policies and how they are utilized are much different. The name may be the same, but how they affect the people is totally different. And I'll give you one example. Because when Pierre Poilievre brought his cost platform to the surface, those wonderful tax cuts for the people, the 15%ers, was all back-end loaded, just like the infrastructure bill during his 2008 term with Stephen Harper, all back-end loaded. Meanwhile, Carney is not doing a budget yet, but he's making sure as soon as they get back to Parliament, the tax breaks go to the people and start immediately. And that's the big difference, and this is what you need to understand. Back to the video.
Anybody who was anybody was there, and it really did change global history. In just 3 weeks, officials from 44 individual countries and some of the world's top economists hammered out the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the predecessor to the World Bank and World Trade Organization, and also decided that GDP would become the benchmark for measuring countries' economies. It's impressive stuff, since they also reportedly managed to squeeze in a few hundred rounds of golf, but even all of that wasn't actually the big news. The namesake agreement of this economic powwow was a plan to set the exchange rates of participating countries' currencies to the American dollar, and then the American dollar itself would be set to a specific amount of physical gold. It was a good deal, but I should make it clear that only other central banks were allowed to make this trade. American citizens weren't allowed to own gold as a store of value at all. The American Fed at the time was pretty flush with gold since 11 years earlier, in 1933, they demanded that their own people hand over almost all the gold they owned in exchange for set compensation. There were minor exemptions made for things like personal jewelry, but Uncle Sam was the only player allowed to hold investment quantities of the stuff. This big stockpile of gold meant that other reserve banks could be pretty confident that they would always be able to change over their American dollars for gold if the need ever arose. To call it a real gold standard was a bit of a stretch, since only a few institutions around the world were allowed to trade the gold back and forth with one another. It was really more of an accounting system. But it was a system that did assist with global trade. Alongside the advent of the standardized shipping container, it made global commerce easier than ever before, because people could now do business between currencies without having to worry about how much they were really worth. Today, that might not sound like a big deal because we can get instantly updated foreign exchange rates on our phone, but before this, it was a big deal. Imagine trying to settle a simple transaction between your friends using airline miles as the medium of exchange. How much is a British Airway point worth compared to a Chris Flyer mile? There are comparison tools, but it's all needlessly complicated. Back in the 1930s, doing business internationally really was this complicated. The Bretton Woods system removed that problem entirely, and global trade boomed. However, over time it became clear that the Americans were getting a slightly better deal than everyone else. In theory, their currency was convertible for physical gold. But since other central banks rarely exercised this right, the Americans could spend a few pennies printing a piece of paper that every other country would have to give them $100 worth of stuff for in exchange. The president of France at the time, Charles de Gaulle, whose name was given to the world's worst airport in the history of humanity until Stansted in London, called this the extraordinary privilege, and he effectively tried to call America on its bluff by actually taking their stockpile of American dollars and converting them back into gold. His successor, President Pompidou, would eventually sail a battleship into New York Harbor to collect the gold owed to them. By this time, there were far more dollars in circulation than the US Fed had the reserves to convert back into gold. Over a decade, they burned through about half of their total reserves before Nixon called it off in his infamous address. Today, even if America wanted to go back onto this compromised version of a gold standard, it doesn't have nearly as much gold as it did back when the global economy was much smaller. And other countries almost certainly wouldn't agree to it anyway, especially not right now. After the Second World War, the USA had extraordinary negotiating power, and it helped to rebuild the economies of Europe and Japan. Today, not so much. So it's time to learn how history works, to find out how abandoning what really amounted to little more than an accounting system did so much damage. This video is brought to you by Storyworth, a service that helps preserve your family. Write her answers or record them by phone, whichever's easiest, and reasons. The first reason was that people realized that their dollar reserves no longer worked as pseudo-gold reserves, so they rushed to rebalance their books. The second reason is that investors are naturally attracted to gold as a safe investment during uncertain times. Like the president resetting the global order of trade and finance? It's up to you which time in particular I am talking about, but in both instances, the price of gold rose dramatically. Now, some economists point to this as proof that money started losing its value the second it wasn't backed by something that couldn't be endlessly printed. Other economists argue that it was actually the Bretton Woods system that was distorting the free market. Gold was locked away and prescribed an arbitrary value as a trinket of exchange rather than being allowed to be priced accurately through the forces of supply and demand. Inflation did still exist between 1944 and 1971. In fact, it was actually one of the reasons why other countries realized that they were better off holding gold than USD. And it was also one of the reasons why Nixon decided to stop convertibility. So the idea that while the price of gold didn't really change for almost 30 years, this was proof to many that it simply was not being priced correctly. Initially, the American markets and the American people liked Nixon's move. The day after the announcement, the market rallied, but there were problems on the horizon. The price of oil rose sharply on the announcement because the oil states were less willing to sell their valuable energy source in exchange for paper backed by nothing. Unlike gold, oil wasn't something that was being buried in a vault somewhere. It was being consumed every day to power the world's industries. The price jump was felt by regular people across the globe, not just at the fuel pump, but in every good or service that was powered by fossil fuels, which was basically all of them. What made things worse is that 3 years later, the law that banned the private ownership of gold in America was repealed, and investors bought back in, driving up the price to all-time highs. In a trend that was probably a shock to nobody, the rate of new money being printed in the US also roughly accelerated. The money supply roughly doubled between 1960 and 1970, but it trebled between 1970 and 1980. Now, more cash flowing around the economy could give more opportunities to small businesses or young workers looking to get a job. Money is ultimately just a tool to facilitate trade. And the more money there is circulating,
In other words, just
easier
another
it is
form of
for
energy.
people to make purchases or investments. As long as things don't go too far, most economists actually acknowledge that a little bit of inflation can actually help regular people, because it ensures that the super wealthy don't just stockpile cash to hold onto value. Of course, the super wealthy have still become very good at hoarding wealth, but to make sure their fortunes grow faster than inflation, they do need to reinvest it into a portfolio of assets that should, at least in theory, benefit the entire economy. So then, if dropping the convertibility of gold wasn't to blame for everything wrong with our modern economy, what else changed in the 1970s? Well, something that you should look at in addition to all these scary charts is that gross domestic product also took off in the 1970s. And it did this for two reasons. Global trade continued to increase despite Bretton Woods falling apart and new technologies compounding to give us some of the most valuable modern businesses in history. With new global markets and finance being done around the world, a lot of fortunes were made, which naturally increased inequality by putting the people at the top further ahead. This is a less equal economy, but it did not necessarily mean that the people at the bottom were getting poorer. In fact, most of them were still getting wealthier, just not quite as fast. Dropping Bretton Woods in many ways let the government run the economy without being so boxed in. At the very least, if it wasn't to thank for this spike in growth, it probably wasn't to blame for all the other problems. What did have more of a real impact were government policies that were pushed ahead in the 1980s, most prominently by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. A push to lower top income and capital gains taxes, reduce business regulation, privatize public industry.
Okay, and this is what you're seeing right now under Trump's tenor. See, the top income and capital gains taxes, just reducing taxes. Conservatives in Canada reducing taxes. And the thought process behind that is a trickle-down effect, which never really happened. History has proved it doesn't happen. But this is what's caused the major problem with affordability and housing prices. Plus, we haven't been building any houses since 1972 anyway. So these are the real problems here that you're facing now. It's not because of the lost liberal decade. Meanwhile, 5 years is because of COVID-19, but that's neither here nor there. Nobody can remember what they had for breakfast this morning that had a conservative lunch, obviously. But it doesn't serve their means to get ahead by letting that go. Even though that lost liberal decade is just utter nonsense. Everybody buys into it because they're easily brainwashed. Even Stephen LeDrew. Yes, Stephen, even you.
Crack down on unions and relax monopoly enforcement did a lot more to accelerate asset appreciation and inequality than the gold standard ever did. The last time that a company was successfully broken up by the Federal Trade Commission in the USA was in 1982. Since then, companies have grown much larger and more dominant, making huge fortunes for their owners, with more power over their workers.
And here's the other thing. A lot of these companies are American companies, so America's really benefited, and especially in their trade with services. What do you mean by services? Microsoft with their software, Oracle with their software, social media, Facebook, X, Google. You know, nobody's taken into that kind of trade either, because that is an exchange of services. So these deficits that Trump's playing his hand with, all of it is a false narrative, just to screw over the bottom 90% to enrich the 0.1%. And that's really where it's at. So we're going to cut it off here. I'm not going to go any further in this video. I appreciate the source that provided this information. I lived through it. I seen it. I witnessed it. This is how things really happen. Say it ain't so, Joe. Yes, it is so, Joe. Shula's Joe Jackson. Nonetheless, thanks for watching. Be good. Kindness starts from within. If you're kind to yourself, it filters out your family, your neighborhood, and everywhere else. Love and peace to everyone. Take care. Ciao for now. Thanks for watching.